Hi, class, and welcome back to Social Psych. This is going to be chapter 12, groups. And you've got to figure if we are talking about social psychology and how people work together, we have to talk about groups of people at some point. And so when we talk about groups, we're very specific in what we mean here. When we talk about groups of people, that is not just people who are next to each other, right? That is one way to group people, but that's not a group in our case. In our case, they need to be interdependent. They need to be influencing one another. They must be connected in some way, right? So, for instance, if you and a couple other people are just standing around in an elevator, or you're just waiting in classroom or listening to a professor talk, right? You're not in a group. You're just next to people. However, if that elevator broke down and you guys had to work together to figure out how to get out of there, or if you weren't just listening to a lecture, but you had to do a group project, that is going to be a group, right? Because you're now relying on other people to get what you want and what you need. So, why are groups important? Well, evolutionarily, right, we can say teamwork makes the dream work. Evolutionarily, we are able to survive better because there's more people around. We are able to hunt in groups. We are able to pass on our genes because there's other people. Human beings have a fundamental need to belong, right? The lack of belonging, putting somebody in solitary confinement, is very bad for a person's health, right? We are social creatures. It is important for us to be involved in groups. And not only that, when we have a group, we are able to feel this inclusion. We're able to have a sense of control, right? If we are in a group of people, society in this case, we have some control over our lives. We have a police force and a fire department that if something goes wrong, somebody can come help. And also, right, groups allow us affection, allow us to feel close to one another. Now, it's important to recognize that not only are they useful from this perspective, but they help us to understand who we are. They help us to figure out social norms and social roles. So while we spent plenty of time talking about social norms when we talked about social influence, social roles, on the other hand, are the way that people think they are supposed to behave, right? For instance, there's a certain way that I'm supposed to behave as a professor versus as a father to my daughter, and you probably don't want me mixing those roles. That would be a bit weird. Now, something we're going to talk about here is very important in terms of psychology. You've probably heard of this, even if you are not somebody very familiar with psychology, but it's the Stanford Prison Experiment, or Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. So, a guy by the name of Philip Zimbardo, we'll see him here in a minute, wanted to run a study and wanted to look at the effect of guards and prisoners and how people are in certain roles in these cases, right? Think about it for the kind of idea that if you are told that you have to be a guard, are you maybe going to change the way you act? And so the question we're asking is, do people make the place violent? Is it the case where um, the people who come in are going to be guards at a prison who are really mean people? Is it the case that they're going to make the prison violent? Or is it the case that everybody comes in nice, but the prison actually itself makes people violent? And that's what we're going to try to look at here. And first of all, this is an extremely ethically dubious study. So, more or less, what we did was we got 14 undergraduates, all males, and we had them randomly assigned to either be a guard or a prisoner. There are no differences between these people, right? You just got randomly assigned out of a hat if you were going to be the guard or the prisoner. What ends up happening is, we end up bringing you into the prison if you're a prisoner. We end up, training you a little bit if you're a guard. And what we tell you is, if you're a guard, your role is to maintain law and order, avoid physically violent things, but prevent escape. And now this mock prison was actually in the basement of the psych department. And so they converted this whole basement floor of the psych department into a fake little prison for a week. And what we see is that very soon these male undergraduates go to some pretty extreme lengths. Now, you can find plenty of documentaries online. So, as I put up here, these kind of previous ones, The Experiment, I'm not going to say they're very good movies, but now if you want to watch some of this, I've got a couple videos posted here you can go ahead and look at that really summarize this. These are the notes on the times that I show in my class. So, if you are interested in learning about this, because, right, this might be something that is worth knowing for a test, uh, pay attention to that. And so a little bit about Zimbardo, which you can kind of see very briefly here. Philip Zimbardo, I always like to think about as um, pretty much like he looks like a vampire, and he also kind of acts like a used car salesman. Please don't tell him I said this. But he does some really interesting things. But what ended up happening, what they found, what those videos I just kind of skipped through show you is that when you take 14 normal undergraduate boys, men, whatever, and you put them, half of them in the cops role and half of them in the robbers role, turns out there's certain social norms that are believed. Cops or prison guards are supposed to act a certain way. And so, if I'm a prison guard, I might think, what is my role? How should I act? And I might do those things, suggesting that our social norms play a role. And you might be wondering, what does this really matter, right? This is some weird study that some guy said, hey, half of you are cops, half of you are robbers, figure it out. Well, it turns out this has some real world implications. For instance, Abu Ghraib um, is a prison in Iraq that took place during the early times of the Iraq War. And in it, Americans did some incredibly unethical things. For instance, this is one picture that is very famously shown. This individual here, you can see, has certain wires tied to their arms. They were led to believe that if their arms were to drop down to their sides, that the wire would connect to a battery and they would be killed. Right, these were U.S. soldiers who did this. And if you recall, U.S. soldiers should not be doing this. And what we find here is that the Stanford Prison Experiment, while not a good experiment by any stretch of the imagination, either in terms of like the mechanics of doing the experiment or in terms of the actual ethics of the experiment, it turns out that this stuff actually does matter and does happen. That a violent place makes people more violent prone. So if I know that I'm going to be a prison guard, I'm going to go in thinking, oh yeah, I probably need to be a jerk. But only if people allow it, right? This doesn't happen all the time. If we follow our chain of command and we follow the legal orders we're supposed to. But that's kind of its own little thing. Again, please recognize the importance of the Stanford Prison Experiment and how social roles really affect the way we choose to act. Moving on from there, let's talk about this really interesting idea of how we act around others. And so, to kind of start this, I ask a question. Imagine that I call you up in front of a classroom full of people and I make you do one of two things. Would you rather tie your shoes in front of a class of people, or would you rather answer some like mathematical problem, right? Some kind of a squared plus b squared equals c squared on the board. Most of you are going to prefer A. You're going to prefer to tie your shoes. Why is that? Well, let's get into it. And it kind of goes back to that first study in social psychology we discussed, the triplet study, where Norman Triplett noticed that people who biked in a group biked faster than people who biked alone. And so he ran a study where he did a similar thing, and he brought in 40 children to turn fishing reels as fast as they could. The beauty of this is you can pull out the fishing reels to be, exactly, let's say 100 feet in length. So everybody has 100 feet they have to reel up as fast as they can. This is a great way to test this. When you have kids do this alone, they do it slower than if you have them do it in a room with other children. And this is the idea of what we call social facilitation. And so when we are in the mere presence of others, just merely having other people around, we tend to have we tend to do better on things, right? This is why you would tie your shoes with no problem. This is universal. This is not just humans, but insects, ants, for instance, dogs, all of these, right, are actually going to be useful in this case, helpers in terms of making us do something, right? And so if you've ever had a dog, two dogs, I should say, you'll notice that if you put the food down, they tend to eat them faster when they're next to each other than if there was only one dog around. So, yeah, sure, that might make sense, but if you're really thinking, you've probably already said, no, this isn't true. Sometimes when I'm in a group, I get really scared. And this goes back to that other really early social psych study where Ringelmann noticed that students who pulled a tug of war rope by themselves put more energy in than students who pulled as a group. Okay, another study, right? And so this comes back to that idea of, right, like maybe it's harder to do things when people are watching and it's a difficult task. So this other study, Gordon Allport, very famous in the world of personality psych, he asked Harvard students to refute philosophical arguments as best they could in a 5-minute period. So, all right, we're going to ask you, right, we're going to talk about this philosophical concept. We know that you're probably not going to be able to undermine it, but do your best in 5 minutes. What we did was we either had other participants in the audience or they did it alone. And students did better alone than when there were other people in the audience. And this is the idea of social inhibition. So, and this maze will make sense here in a couple minutes here. But social inhibition is the opposite of social facilitation. Social inhibition is the idea that having other people around inhibits or makes worse our performance. So, how is it possible that having people around can make us better and having people around can make us worse? So, let's get to that. Turns out it's what type of task is what depends here. So, in terms of simple tasks, the mere presence of others really helps us. When we have to tie our shoes, this is something we know what to do. You don't even have to really use your brain to tie your shoes, right? You can just do that simply. However, slower or more difficult tasks, when other people are around, that makes you more likely to, choke, and not physically, but have an issue here. And so the idea is that when there are other people around, what is that doing? That is causing us arousal. And by arousal, we're talking physiological arousal. Oh God, are they watching me? Right? Something like that. And so when we're worried about that, we default to our kind of normal action tendency, whatever our normal response is. And so on a simple or well-learned task, right? If a bunch of people are watching you and you have to tie your shoes or, drink a cup of water, you're going to do okay. However, on a difficult task, I bring you up and ask you, solve this math problem that you haven't done in 5 years. Oh no, it's going to make you a lot worse. So, as we mentioned, this is not just in humans. And one test actually looked at this with cockroaches. This is an amazing experiment, if you ask me. And so we asked them, we made them run a simple or complex maze. And then what we did was we either had them run this maze alone, or, and I should say this maze was all kind of clear plexiglass so they could see through it, or we built little, for lack of a better term, like stands for other cockroaches that they could watch. And we saw how long it took for them to complete the maze. So right over here, we have 2 easy mazes. Cockroaches don't like light. So if you want them to go somewhere, you shine a light and they run over to somewhere they can hide in. So with a simple maze is, can this cockroach run away from a light in a straight line? On the other side, complex mazes, there is kind of this plus sign version of the maze where only one of these one of these other 3 boxes is open for the cockroach to escape the light. So if the cockroach goes all the way to the end and it's closed, they're going to have to turn around and figure out something. Now, again, you notice we either have them do this alone in these or in a group with a little audience box here. What ends up happening? Well, look at that, comparing alone with an audience, that cockroaches run faster with others, just like humans ride bicycles faster together. However, when there's others watching cockroaches from these little stands, even they are struggling with this. You are seeing it's taking them longer to complete this task, which is a very interesting thing. But why? Why does this happen? Well, part of this is sometimes when we watch other people or we know we're being watched, we're afraid of how we are going to be evaluated. So, we're kind of nervous about this. And so we're concerned for how others are viewing us. A really cool study had basically a woman on a treadmill in front of a big glass wall. Right. So imagine just like if you were at the gym at Stetson, where there's a big glass wall and you can see outside, there's a running path outside of this. And what we did was we measured how fast men ran past this woman on a treadmill inside. Half the time, though, the treadmill wasn't faced at the glass and the path, but it was actually faced away, turned around. And it turns out that men run faster in this case when they are being watched by a woman on a treadmill versus a woman is running on a treadmill but not watching them. Not only that, right, when other people are around, especially people we don't know, we might be a little bit more alert. We don't know if they're going to make fun of us, if they're going to hurt us, things like this. And right, this kind of goes to show in this really interesting study looking at putting on shoes versus putting on these kind of lab shoes. And so the idea here is we ask you to come into a lab and take off your shoes. And then we say, all right, thank you very much. Can you go ahead and put on your shoes? And we time it. How long does it take you to put on your shoes? Now, we don't tell them that we're timing it. We just do it behind their back. And, it takes people about 15-ish seconds to tie their own shoes. Now, when somebody else is nearby, just, another student is in the room, sitting there reading a book, people do it faster than if it was alone. And if the audience is paying attention to how fast you're tying your shoes, you're going to go even faster on this easy task. Flip it around though, asking you to put on these like weird shoes that, you're not used to. Most people take around 30 seconds on average by themselves. It takes people longer when somebody is in the room and even longer when somebody is watching them in the room. So part of this comes down to distraction, right? We are being distracted by thinking, oh, what if these people are evaluating what we're doing? What if they're, noticing us? And so that might cause us to overload our mental resources and screw up. Now, if any of you are anything like me, you hate group projects because you have been in the situation where you've had to do an entire group project by yourself. If you're not one of those people and somebody's done a group project for you, you should thank them. But this is the idea of social loafing. So if you're the person who isn't doing anything for your group project, you're probably falling into this idea of social loafing, this idea that you are going to sit around, I like to think like a loaf of bread, right? Not do anything. And so this comes back to that tug of war study that people pull less hard in a group rather than individually. And right, you clap less loud in a group kind of thing here. Does it matter if the task is easy or complex? Yeah. If the task is easy, you're more likely to loaf. If the task is complex, you're more likely to help out. If you and like your 4 siblings, say, are asked to set up the table for dinner, none of you want to do it, right? But if you and your 4 siblings have to pack tonight to get ready to go on a trip tomorrow and you're all excited for it, you're going to work together more, right? It's a more complex topic. Now, when it comes to who is more likely to socially loaf, people low on what we call achievement motivation, people who just are lower in this need to achieve, people lower in need for cognition. Unfortunately, men are more likely to loaf, and people from individualistic, right? Not interdependent, but independent. Yes, I'm getting it right. I always mess this up. Excuse me. Individualistic. So the individual cultures, America, Western Europe, these people are more likely to loaf than people from East Asia, South America, etc. How else we can reduce loafing is by making individuals accountable. Make part of the grade rely on other people's, discussions of your work. Making the task challenging is going to be good. You're going to loaf if it's easier. You need to make the goal important to everybody. If you are in a group project that's worth 50% of your grade and somebody just doesn't care about grades, they're going to loaf more likely than all. And then it's important to recognize that if we're able to make people feel their contribution is important and that if they fail, bad things are going to happen to them, this is going to make people less likely to loaf. But you could imagine designing a good group project to do all of this is more difficult said than done, hence why I don't do group projects. Now let's take a slight detour and talk about how groups make decisions, because it's very different than how individuals make decisions. And one question we can ask is, do groups make better decisions than individuals? Sometimes. And I like this quote from Men in Black, where a person is smart, but people are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals. This is kind of true, and we'll talk about this when we get into crowds. Well, it turns out that what I just showed you is a lie if there is a true factual answer. For instance, if I were to show a picture of a jar of jelly beans in front of us, and I asked you all to guess how many were in it, none of you would get it right. Some of you might be close, some of you might not be close, but it turns out that people actually are more likely to have the correct answer if you average everybody's answers together. That's going to be the closest answer. Turns out that people can pool their unique knowledge. They can pool anything that they specifically know. If there are 10 of us traveling down the road in a bus and the bus breaks down because the tire went flat, if we all take what we know, maybe somebody knows how to fix a flat tire and can help us. But it's important to note, on the other hand, that when we are asking questions and doing things in groups, sometimes certain aspects of just being in a group make it less likely that we are going to do what we want. Sometimes we fail to share unique information. And I'd like to talk about a really cool study looking at this. What we are going to talk about here is the idea that when we get into groups and we ask people to talk about things, well, what are we all going to talk about? People tend to talk about things that we all already know, right? We're not going to bring in the specific things that we know. So in this study, Dr. Gary Stacer, who was one of my undergraduate advisors, asked people to basically imagine that they were going to vote for one of two student presidents, candidate A and candidate B. So everybody's going to read some of the info about candidate A and candidate B, and then they're going to go into groups of 4, and they are going to talk about it and come to an answer. So it's important to note that what we're going to do is manipulate candidate A, but candidate B is always going to have 4 positives and 4 negatives. So we are always going to compare against somebody who has 4 pluses and 4 minuses, which averages out. In one of the 2 conditions, though, the first candidate that was going against the 4v4 had 8 positives and 4 negatives. So, right, this has 4 more positives than negatives, and right, 4 more positive overall. People should always vote for this guy, right? Because this guy has more positives than candidate B. However, some other people got information that candidate A had 2 positive traits and 4 negative traits, as well as this idea that everyone else has 2 unshared qualities of candidate A. Excuse me one second. So what are we looking at here? This is kind of weird to see in the small. So I've kind of put this in a big picture. So in the shared info condition, everybody read all of this information here, right? They read that the student body candidate said that he wanted to reduce tuition. He wanted to, make the dorms bigger, give people better food. But there were some negatives. He wanted to add comprehensive exams, something like this. However, some other people got this as their kind of group info, but everybody else got their own pieces of information that weren't shared with the group. So what do we see here is that we are comparing eight positives and four negatives in the shared condition. However, in the unshared condition, this person, right, this candidate actually is better. They have 10 positive traits and 4 negative traits. However, right, people tend to prefer candidate A in the shared condition, but they don't tend to prefer candidate A in the unshared condition. Why? Because they're failing to share this info here. They're only talking about the 2 positives and the 4 negatives that everybody knows. Imagine that you come into this conversation, you say, well, I read that he was going to lower prices, for food. And somebody goes, well, I didn't hear that. I don't remember that. And you go, oh, never mind. So it turns out that how much information we're sharing with each other is a very important aspect of this. And this is related to one of the most unfortunately scary things we're going to talk about in this section, which is groupthink. It's the fact that for human beings, we often would prefer to go with the group than we would to be absolutely correct. And so what do I mean by that? We've all kind of experienced this. If you and your friends have asked, hey, where do you want to go for dinner tonight? And you're like, I'm not sure. And 3 people say, I want to get tacos or I want to get Mexican, whatever. And you are thinking, you're like, well, I don't really know. I kind of want a pizza. But you just, instead of saying anything about it, you just choose to say, whatever. Everybody else is going with it. I'm just going to shut my mouth and say, yeah, tacos are fine. Sure, that's one thing with your friends, but it can get more extreme. So there are some really interesting models of this, and we're going to kind of talk about this as we go through this. So what you'll notice here is that there are some antecedent or preconditions, things that are going to cause or make it more likely for groupthink to happen. Groups that are very cohesive, that are, very close together. Groups that are, not only close together, but they're insulated. There's not many people from outside the group around. Groups that are only looking for information that proves them right. Groups that have a leader who is very stress, inducing, and is, very much telling you how to do things. In these situations, it's hard to stand up to this, right? Imagine that your boss tells you, this is the way I want it done, and we are going to do it that way. But you maybe know there's a reason that it's not going to work, and you just don't know how to raise your hand and say something. So this idea of groupthink is more likely to occur when we are dealing with somebody who is, as a leader of this group, which we'll kind of get into more later, who is very much not necessarily worried about the relationships with their subordinates. And so the other side of this is that a group that is highly cohesive, that it's really important for them to stay together, that the idea that we might all say out loud that we agree, even if we don't think it's true. One of the major symptoms of groupthink is the idea of self-censorship. It's the idea that even if you disagree with something, you shut your mouth, you keep it quiet. Why? Because you don't want to rock the boat. Now, you might also feel this illusion of invulnerability as a group member here, that, we can't do any wrong. We're perfect. We're the best group. And that we are morally right, at the most extreme, that God is on our side, the belief that we are doing the right thing. Typically, this also leads to a stereotyped view of an outgroup, thinking that everybody who isn't like you is very different. And then there's a pressure to conform, and an illusion that everybody agrees. So, a stupid but kind of good example of this is, imagine that, you for some reason are on Facebook and you join like a cats are the best group. Well, what is going to happen here is that people are going to, as they talk more and more, eventually start thinking like, people who like dogs are really stupid, this stereotyped outgroup. And then anybody who says like, hey, I have a dog and a cat and I like them both, is maybe going to be kind of crowded out and be like, shush, we don't want to hear you type thinking. And so this can lead to some really bad things, right? At the most extreme, it leads to the lack of searching for complete information, right? Just using this confirmation bias, a failure to examine risks or other alternatives. This belief that, why would we even try something else? We're great, we're perfect, we don't need to. This failure to develop contingency plans if things go wrong, because why would things go wrong here? So recognizing the idea that if you have a group of people who all are just agreeing together and just saying, yeah, this is right, and not really thinking of the consequences, we might be making very bad decisions. And so how can we prevent this? Well, be impartial, but that's not something we can always easily do. So I always suggest you ask somebody on purpose in your group to play the devil's advocate. You give them that social role so people aren't thinking that they're being a jerk. You just think, well, it's my job to try to poke holes in our argument, instead of just agreeing with this. Seeking outside opinions, finding groups of people who are not in your group to help you think about these other things. Making smaller groups, right? Making a subcommittee where some group members can work together on things, or, do an anonymous opinion. Ask people to write down or, post their info, or, do some kind of online survey to get this, is helpful in preventing groupthink here. But from groupthink, we move on to a similar but not quite the same topic called group polarization. And so group polarization is the idea that as group members start to talk about things, they tend to get more extreme. Their views tend to polarize, go from the middle, right, towards one pole, right? Go from, neutral to more extreme. And political polarization is a huge thing in this day and age, right? In 2024, we know that political polarization has gotten more and more extreme in the past 20 years. However, this really interesting study noting polarization had two different towns in Colorado. I think it was Boulder, Colorado, and Colorado Springs, Boulder being a much more liberal city and Colorado Springs being a conservative city, basically set up in these two cities a little town hall to discuss politics. And what they asked is everybody that came in, before everybody started talking, rate your political beliefs. Where do you fall on the political spectrum? Okay, everybody, now chat about your political beliefs and then leave. As you leave, how polarized are you? How do you feel about certain things? And notice right here that in Boulder, Colorado, the liberal city, that while people tended to be more liberal overall, that after discussion, they became more polarized. They became even more liberal. Findings work the same for Colorado Springs. If anything, I would argue that it's more intense in the conservative side of things because it's pulling people further. However, I think this would also argue that the people who showed up for the Boulder meeting were overall more liberal than the people who showed up to the Colorado meeting, at least beforehand. Anyways, why does political polarization, group polarization, why does this happen? Well, one theory that we can discuss is this persuasive arguments interpretation. The idea that everybody who's going to ask a question or, kind of bring up a topic might bring up a persuasive argument that you hadn't heard before. Oh, I hadn't thought about that, and that might be a good thing to help convince me. On the other hand, there's the social comparison interpretation. So this is the idea that we're not really sure how other people feel about, right, what their opinions are on a specific topic. So we're gonna kind of feel it out first to see how everybody else feels. Right? You don't want to be the one saying like, "Boy, I hate cats," in a room full of cat lovers, right? So you're gonna kind of maybe check that out. So that is the idea that you're gonna first maybe feel this out, and that is going to then allow you to push people in a direction here. Moving on, let's talk about the fact that we're monkeys at the end of the day, and we live in a social hierarchy. And to do that, we need to talk about the fact that we have leaders in this hierarchy, the people at the top. What does it mean to be a leader, right? You can think of any of these people as possible leaders, for better or worse. And what we mean by leader is generally just the person who has the most influence on a group. I'm the leader of the class because I'm the one who tells you to take exams or do whatever. But what makes a good leader? Well, there's two views. The first view is this idea of a great person theory. This idea that there are specific personality traits that would make a good leader. Things like intelligence, charisma, or social skills. Is it true? Well, not really. There is no good predictive pattern of specific personality traits that make you a better leader. On the other hand, we have the right person, right situation view, which, if you look at it, sounds very much like our formula, or, right? The behavior is functional on the person and the situation. So that an effective leader really comes down to who they are and the type of situation. And this is called also known as the contingency theory of leadership. It's contingent on what situation you are in. And so there are certain leaders who are focused on tasks, right? Get your tasks done in high control situations. The captain, right, of your unit in in the army is going to focus you on getting your tasks done, and he's going to have a lot of control over what you do. And also in low control situations, for running summer research, this is really a very low control situation. I tell you, here are the tasks you do, go do them. On the other hand, there's relational oriented leaders. So in situations where control needs to be a little bit in the middle here, these people are going to be more focused on the relationships between one another, people in the group. So if you are working at a fast food restaurant, a good leader ought to be also paying attention to the relationships between people because there's a little bit of wiggle room here. However, this is all underlined by our leader. Our leader is a person who has power over us, in this case, or right, the person who is able to control their own outcomes or the outcomes of others, right? I have a boss who writes my checks, and they have power over me in that case. And so this is any way that we have the ability to influence others and make a difference on them. I have power over you in a college classroom. However, if you are just watching these videos for fun, why? I have no power over you. Compare power to another dimension on this, status. Status is more about respect, right? So people can be low in power or high in power, but they can also be low in status and high in status. Status can give power, right? For instance, if you are the Pope, chances are people are going to let you go past, cut you in line or whatever is the famous example here. But right, if you have power without status, maybe you are a politician who's been hired or elected, and then you've gone back on every promise, and now nobody likes you. Well, you still got power, but nobody is respecting you. Nobody's admiring you. On the other hand, right, you can have status without power, but I do think that status gives people power. For instance, if you were the Pope, like we mentioned, and you're standing in line at the DMV, why? I don't know. Chances are somebody's going to move out of the way for you and let you go in front of them, but they don't have to. You don't have the power to say, get out of my way. So power influences our social behavior in some different ways. For instance, we can talk about authority. Right, these very institutionalized and formal power roles. So thinking about people or things that we have to tend to obey, we might think of this. But we can also think about this dimension of dominance, this idea of trying to demonstrate power. Certainly, having a search warrant is going to be a way in which the government has power to search your house. However, if a cop stands at your door and says, "You need to let me in your house right now," maybe they are trying to demonstrate that power, even if they don't have the necessary authority to do this. And the book talks about Lyndon B. Johnson, a president of the United States, who was famous for this very dominant stance where he would get in people's faces like this. And so it's demonstrating the fact that, like, what are you going to do? I'm the president of the United States. And so he's able to actually, do this and be dominant and display that power using his authority. Well, how is it that we gain power? Well, there's kind of two major paths to power. There's the virtuous path or the vice path. In the virtuous path, people gain power through being courageous, through being humane, right? Being kind, sympathetic, through being just, right? Being teamwork oriented, being fair, and through temperance, the idea of being not humiliated, the idea of having humility, right? Not being super prideful, the ability to forgive. Those are the things we want in people who have power, and those tend to give us some sort of status or power if we present those factors. However, we can talk about the dark triad here. Machiavellianism, named after a guy, Machiavelli, who wrote an essay during the Enlightenment era about how if you want to get ahead, why don't you just act like a real jerk and manipulate people? He's not wrong. Narcissism, right? People can gain power through being narcissistic, being entitled, and going and getting these things. And psychopathy, being a psychopath, lacking empathy, going for aggression. And once we get power, there's some research to say that power affects how we decide to act. Is it the case that power corrupts? No, power reveals. Turns out that if you have high power, you are able to have more freedom in the world because you have more resources. If I have $1 million, I can go wreck my car tomorrow and just buy a new one, right? And I have more power to do that. I can pay off a speeding ticket, right? Better than if I'm broke. High power is also associated with doing unethical behaviors. Being high in power makes you more likely to do illegal or unethical things. On the other hand, low power causes individuals to be more cautious. You can think of high power doing this promotion focused and low power doing this prevention focused. Where low power, you have less resources, less freedom to do what you want. A person who doesn't have much money in the bank can't take off time to go on a vacation, for instance. They have less freedom for what they can do. In a really cool study, we asked people a really simple thing. Hey, go draw a capital E on your forehead. That's it. But before we did this, we either made them feel like they were in high power or in low power. Like, think about a time you had a lot of, control over other people, or think about a time that other people controlled you. And what do you know? That when we compare this, people high in power are more likely to draw the E for them. I don't know how this is going to work. Right? But people low in power are more likely to draw the E so that another person looking at them is going to see the E. People high in power are more focused on themselves. They draw the E backwards so that it looks right in a mirror to them. Compare that to people low in power who are drawing the E so it can look right to other people on average. So it suggests that power can actually lower how much empathy we feel towards one another. So let's summarize what we've kind of talked about here as this really interesting idea about how groups work. But there's some downsides to groups, and it's the fact that sometimes groups can turn into mobs, right? You imagine any kind of major event. Unfortunately, Storm Area 51 did not make as much of a big impact as we would have maybe liked it to. But what happens when people get into big groups of crowds is they tend to lose themselves. They have this loosening of what they consider their normal sense of what is and isn't okay. People are more likely to yell out in a crowd, things of this nature. Why? You're less likely to be singled out. It's harder for people to make you accountable for your attention, for your actions. If, right, you do something bad, maybe you can get away before the cops get there. And if the group starts acting rowdy, you're more likely to act rowdy like that group. All of this is enhanced if you can't see the person's face or you lower their identifiability. It's a dark environment, it's late at night, you're wearing a mask, something like this makes it more likely you will de-individuate. You will make it you will lose some of yourself. So you can see the model of de-individuation here, where at the beginning, right, kind of beforehand, if you're in an anonymous place, if you are diffused, right, that responsibility is diffused, if this crowd is really energetic too, and if there's a lot of stimuli, sight, sound, noises, people are bumping into you, you're more likely to stop feeling like you and more like you're part of the crowd. And what is happening here is you're not paying attention as much to what you're doing and thinking, oh, is this right? You are less in concern with what other people are going to think about you, and you're more likely to remove these kind of feelings of guilt, fear, shame, etc. So you'll act impulsive, irrational, emotional, and possibly antisocial, more likely to flip a car. And this goes along with John Gabriel's greater internet dickwad theory, which suggests that if you take a normal person, give them anonymity and an audience, they'll turn into a dickwad. And he's kind of right. Right? And this just makes sense of why people on the internet maybe don't say the things they would say if it was one-on-one to your face. Now, this video here is from a guy called Darren Brown, and it is a video called Remote Control. I can't watch this. This is something you can watch for free on YouTube. It's 30 minutes. I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing. But what I will say is this is an incredible example of de-individuation. And so what he does in this is he puts people in a room and he makes them anonymous by giving them these really scary, sketchy looking masks, and then kind of turns down the light to give them all this ominous look. Then what the whole thing is that you have a remote control and you're going to vote. And so everybody in this room is voting on basically what's going to happen to this person. This is almost like, turning real life into a video game for somebody. And what happened is we signed up this guy, who is an actor, and we said, hey, will you come in for a shoot or, a tryout? Then we told him he didn't get the part, but we actually are going to use this guy. He doesn't know this is happening. And what ends up happening is every couple minutes, these people are given an option to mess with this dude. This random dude who has no idea what's going on. And there's a positive and a negative outcome. For instance, they kind of start off at the bar, and the first thing we offer is, should we give this guy a free drink or should we overcharge him for it? They overcharge him. The second one was going to a corner store, and do you want to give it so that this guy is like the 1,000th customer and he wins something, or do we want to quote unquote catch him shoplifting even though he didn't? And then do we want him to be innocent because we made him get caught shoplifting? Then do we want him to get away with it, be scot off innocent, or arrested? They get him arrested. Then the final one before the finale is the free TV versus fired from his job, where they say, let's get him fired from his job. Now, there's one more video showing the end of this, and I highly suggest you watch this because it goes to show you de-individuation. If you put people in a room and you give them the feeling that it's okay to do these things, they will ruin a man's life, and they will laugh the entire time they do it. It's a very sobering video, which I highly suggest you watch. But to finish up on this, de-individuation does happen not just in a room or the internet. It happens in war. Turns out that 80% of cultures that de-individuate before battle, that put on war paint, are labeled as high ferocity, meaning they engaged in more violent behaviors during war, including headhunting, including torture, including killing civilians. Why? Because it's part of that not feeling like you're you. Back in Zimbardo's experiment, we gave the guards these big sunglasses because it makes them look less human, right? De-individuate them. It turns out that when you are looking at individuals who are threatening to jump off of a tall building, when crowds get large or it's late in the day, people are more likely to yell very inappropriate things, encouraging people to jump, baiting them to jump in this case. And of course, the most unethical thing you could ever think about is the fact that in Halloween time, when we are looking at people who are wearing masks versus not, and people who are alone versus in a group, it turns out that when you are in a group with a mask, you're much more likely to take more candy than you are supposed to, compared to if you are alone and you don't have a mask on. You're very unlikely, right? If you are in a group, you're more likely to take this candy, especially if you are not anonymous. So I just talked about how this can be really bad, how big groups of crowds can get out of hand. Can we find ourselves? Well, yeah, we can individuate, right? Re-individuate in this case. We can enhance our sense of identity by focusing on the self. Pull out your phone, look at you, right? Recognize, it's kind of this thought like, would my mom or dad be proud of what I'm doing right now, right? Trying to act in accordance with your values. This goes back to the self-awareness theory, the idea when we're aware that people are watching us. That makes us think, oh no, am I doing the right things, right? Am I wearing pants today? A really cool study looking at this had an honesty box where we asked people to pay for any milk they used, right? So if you're going to use some milk, can you help pitch in for a couple dollars for it, or a couple whatever it was, in this case, pounds. However, what we differentiated was what was on the wall next to the milk. And we either put flowers or a set of eyes. And on the weeks with eyes, people paid more money for milk than on the weeks with flowers. Why? It's going to be the argument that it's the idea, right, that we think somebody's watching us, also known as the spotlight effect. The belief that sometimes we think that people are paying attention to us even when they're not really doing that. So, one thing we can do is think, oh no, I am being watched. Not something super healthy to do, but you get the idea. Anyways, that covers everything I wanted to talk about with groups. I hope you all found this useful, but if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But other than that, I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.